particularly in the arts, blocks can come up in a number of different ways. Some might be, more strictly about, for instance, somebody who wanted to be, I was working with, who was a film writer and felt very blocked at producing the reports and, producing his scripts. And what we discovered that when we started to go into it was that he had a very fixed way of approaching it. And we sort of moved him out of one modality, which was sitting in front of a blank piece of paper and getting very frustrated, into using movement and drawing and diagrams. And that is the kind of block that I often work with people, in that they're trying to do something and achieve something, but the way that they're doing it isn't actually working for them. So we try and devise new methods using the inner game approach of tackling the same thing, but in a way perhaps they hadn't attempted it before. I think that's a very difficult one to answer, because creative, I think that formulaic and creativity distinction could be very appropriate in a film script, for instance. But, with an actor performing a piece, very often they're going to have to discover something in doing the piece that they didn't know before. And for me, that's the essence of creativity when people are working, that they seem to be able to use something that hasn't come before, and they've discovered it and then find a way of working with it. So to give an example of people who are very self-critical when they're performing, actors, which is a common issue. They become so self-conscious that they're not really aware of performing anymore. They're only aware of that they're not doing it right, whatever that means. So a common technique that we might often use with an actor who doesn't feel fully engaged with the piece and is very aware of an inner self-critic is perhaps put an invisible line on the floor where 10 is when they're fully engaged with the piece and 0 is when they feel very self-conscious and self-critical. And then invite them to do the piece, but have the game of being on the line at the right place according to how much they're feeling that self-inner critic or not. And what that does is it takes what's ostensibly a block, which is the inner critic, and actually turns it into something the person can usefully use in the piece by enabling to have an inner motivation. You see the person moving around on the piece, and something's happening inside with them, but you don't know what's driving it. So you've taken that thing, that issue that was a block, and actually given them something creative to do with it that enables them to use it in an effective way that they hadn't been able to do before. I mean, I've run a whole weekend workshop on dealing with the inner critic, and I think starting to actually have some separation from it is a very good first step. There's a lot of people, their critics come in so automatically, they're not even aware that they're doing it to themselves. So for instance, one exercise we do is we allow somebody else to become their inner critic. They do a piece and note down what the inner critic was saying, and then they have to give that piece of paper to somebody else, and somebody else becomes their inner critic, which is a very interesting experience for most people, to actually have that voice externally instead of internally. And once they start to realize that it's a voice that they're creating internally, and they might have some choice about how they're treating themselves, that's usually a bit of an aha moment to thinking about, well, is the way that I'm treating myself, especially when I get internal, external criticism, supporting me or hindering me in my creative process? I think that's a very interesting question. I think what you're just saying is actually probably the roots to some extent of the inner critic, in the sense that we fear that that might happen to us at some level, that we're going to make a complete fool of ourselves. And the inner critic comes up as a kind of protective mechanism to stop us doing it, but it gets totally out of control. Because the more we react against it, then the stronger the critic becomes, or the more we allow ourselves to be hurt by the critic instead of just observing it. I've never had a problem with people who think they're massively better than they really are, to be honest. Certainly not everybody can be a top-class opera singer, but you can work on that, and then you can decide whether you want to do the work. I think the key is to get your feedback in what's the word? Loving is what came to mind, but at least sort of a nurturing way. Because the problem that most people get with their feedback, it's all about, I mean, the most common feedback that people were saying was that was just crap, which, doesn't give you any information at all about, well, which bits were okay and which bits weren't so okay. What exactly does crap mean anyway? How can I improve? Now, there's always things that people can do to improve. And I think the essence of, working with the inner critic is to be able to say, okay, you're just telling me I'm crap, so what specifically should I change? And it's very interesting, as soon as people start to get into a dialogue with the inner critic, particularly asking it for help and information, it very often sort of at least quietens it down and possibly silences it. Because what the critic's game is, and what we often do inside, is say something nasty to ourselves, like, you're crap, react against it, oh God, that really hurts. And then it's a bit like telling a little child, don't press this button. The critic will keep going again, but again, crap, crap, crap. And people react against it. And they're trying to sort of like run a race with heavy boots on their feet, because all they're doing is actually making their inner world so difficult for themselves that it's very hard to give the performance that they actually want to. I mean, you can say, somebody sang a song, well, you were flat for X, Y, and Z bits of it, you'll have to do a lot of work to get over that. That's useful feedback. Maybe that person is prepared to do the work, maybe they won't, or maybe they can't. But to say to somebody, you're just useless, no one's ever going to want to listen to you, it's just an example of really sort of crushing the human spirit, I would say. Yeah, and I guess the question with that person, well, what's stopping you actually getting the feedback? What have you learned from your first book? Or more to the point, why didn't you actually produce, a draft of your first free book and chapter headings to get some feedback before you even started? I think some people do throw themselves into things and just hope that it's going to work out. I'm not advocating that at all, but I think, we can very usefully learn from good feedback right from the moment that we start the creative process, if we're open to it. And again, I think as a coach, you have a duty to help people be realistic, but it's certainly possible to temper that realism with kindness and helping people find out for themselves.
So when you have clients who want to be more creative in their expression, how do you help them to decide whether what they're striving for is in the right field, whether the skill that they're trying to master is the skill that they are likely to achieve the most success in? How do you distinguish between what their real talents are, I suppose, as opposed to something that is going to lead to a dead end?
Well, I certainly don't feel I can set myself up as to say to somebody, you're going to succeed on this or not. I think touching people, looking at people's passion, what they really want to do, and actually supporting them in taking the steps to start making that a reality and seeing how they get on, and seeing if they want to continue. I mean, certainly, a couple of years ago, I did a stand-up comedy course and I loved doing it. And I did a few gigs afterwards and I enjoyed it. But, the effort of dragging yourself out on a wet night to perform to half a dozen other comedians, and you have to do that probably 50 to 100 times to start getting good, was just too much for me. And I might have been very good at that, but I just couldn't face that particular part of that type of work. So, people have their own inner motivations. And I think part of what a coach will do will see, well, does this person have the passion, the motivation, the ability to learn, and the natural talent to be a success at what they do? But, I think it'd be very cruel to tell somebody, you're never going to make it. If, there's a chance they're enjoying it and they're enjoying the performance and enjoying the process, and that's what they want to do, why do I have or somebody else to say is you're never going to make it? And there are examples certainly through history of where people have been told that information and then have gone on to be very successful. I mean, I think the Fred Astaire initial audition was, can't act, can't sing, dances a bit. And, that was his feedback after his audition.
yes, we have countless examples like that, like J.K. Rowling, you know, how many.
Oh yes, all those rejections.
Yeah. So basically, it's like, as a coach, you would obviously empower the person to decide for themselves what, you know, what skill it is that they want to develop, and sometimes it will fizzle out after a while.
Yeah, sometimes it will, and that's perfectly valid. That's what's right for them. I mean, certainly I see my role as a coach not to either discourage them to say, you know, don't do it, but to really help them get the feedback and take a clear, objective look, but, you know, with kindness about it. Because, you know, the thing about the inner critic, which we started the discussion about, is usually it's very unkind, it's very unhelpful. And that kind of feedback just leaves people quite twisted and unhappy inside, and very sort of blocked in terms of actually taking the creative process forward.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned the word kindness, because it was from that aspect that I was asking those questions in terms of ethics, because sometimes I see coaches promising to help clients become whoever they want to be. It's like, you know, dream big, and sometimes those dreams that are far too big for them, they construct it rather than construct it.
Yeah, no, and I'd agree with you. The difficulty, and I think the skill of, you know, part of the coaching process is to know, well, you know, how fair is it to ask this person to continue if they're really not enjoying it, or they're losing all their money in it, or whatever, when I don't think they'll make it. But on the other hand, you know, what right do I have to trample on somebody's dreams if this is what they really want to try and do? So I think as a coach, you're balancing those two contradictory impulses, you know, as you're working with somebody.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier about the point about being realistic as well, you know, that the dreams need to be realistic.
Yeah, or at least tempered with reality.
Yes, and responsive to feedback.
Yeah, and, you know, being willing to engage with what goes along with the coaching, with, you know, the creative process. As I said, you know, it'd be great if you could just be a comedian and get up on stage and be funny first of all. Most people I know, and I know several comedians, have been through a tortuous learning process of dying night after night after night until they found out what worked. Now that for most people, including me, is just too painful to go through. But, you know, some people can do that.
It requires so much courage, doesn't it?
Yeah, and a particular type of courage and determination, which not many people have. What I like about working with creatives is often it inspires me to be creative in how I work with them. I was just remembering one particular incident where I was working with an actor, a horrific inner critic. You know, like she was a woman, and she had this really horrible dragon type inner critic. And we did this exercise where she, every time she heard the critic, she'd step aside from doing the piece and say back to herself what the critic was saying. Then a particular moment, I just had an impulse and saying, right, let the critic do the piece. And suddenly she stepped into the critic, and this whole new character and energy came out. And, you know, it's just, I was surprised at myself for coming up with the idea, but it so worked. And I think that's what's so inspiring about working with creative people, is it inspires you to come up with ideas yourself and think of ways of doing things that you hadn't, you know, discover ways of doing things in the moment that you hadn't done before.